Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In chapter 15 of his work, Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes is going to set out the other laws of nature. And what are the other laws? Well, those in addition to the first and second laws of nature that he detailed in the previous chapter. As it turns out, by my count, there's about 14 entirely. At a certain point in the text, he just stops numbering them and goes on and tells us there's another and another, and we can tally them up and put them into this sort of arrangement. Now, these are incredibly important for understanding Hobbes' perspective, not only on what we can call social and political philosophy, how things ought to be arranged within society, but also for moral philosophy or ethics. And he will indeed claim that his treatment of this is the true and only moral philosophy, which an interesting claim we'll talk about elsewhere. It has some important implications for what ought to be taught in the schools. We should remind ourselves from chapter 14 what a law of nature is. So he tells us that it's a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a person is forbidden to do that which is destructive of their life, or taketh away the means of preserving the same, and to omit that, leave that out, by which he thinketh it may well be best preserved. And so these are, laws that we can derive through our rational activity, figuring out what is going to conduce to staying alive and enjoying a decent life. And there's a few other aspects of the laws of nature before we look at the specifics of them that we should highlight, because he tells us these in chapter 15, and they are quite important. So the first bit is that he says that they oblige in what he calls in foro interno, right? So what does that mean? It means that they are obligatory on us. They bind to a desire that they should take place. And then he contrasts that to in foro external, that is to putting them in act. They don't always oblige us in that way. They're not effective in the sense of, we realize them and we automatically start acting that way. We need other things to make sure that we're actually going to follow them. So that's an important thing. We can recognize the laws. That doesn't mean that we're always going to automatically do what they require us to do or forbid us to do, right? The other thing that he says that's really interesting right after that, though, he says the laws of nature are immutable and eternal. So they don't exist, you could say, in the state of nature, or at least they're not recognized in the state of nature, and yet they have a unchangeable, that's what immutable is, and eternal existence. Presumably, if there were other rational beings besides humans, these laws of nature would be binding upon them as well. And Hobbes does believe that there is a God, so they could exist in God's mind and be eternal in that way. But the point here is that they're not going to change. And he says, why? Injustice, ingratitude, arrogance, pride, iniquity, exception of persons, and the rest can never be made lawful, for it can never be that war shall preserve life and peace destroy it. So this goes back to the nature of laws of nature, which is that they tell us how to preserve our own life, and you could say human life more generally, since they're binding on other people. Now, there's another point to this. He brought up all these things like injustice, ingratitude, arrogance, pride. Those are what we call vices. And he tells us that the science of virtue and vice is moral philosophy. Therefore, the true doctrine of the laws of nature is the true moral philosophy. All of these laws are not only what we could call deontological rules, obey these, they also express a certain engagement with what we traditionally call virtue ethics. So Hobbes is at least framing these in terms of a familiar language of virtue and vice. So those are important traits. Let's look at the laws themselves. Now, the third law, which is very short, he gives a very long discussion to, much of which we're going to skip over, about the nature of justice and injustice. So the third law is simply we should perform the covenants that we have made. If we want to have a viable society in which, we can fulfill the first two laws, then we actually have to follow through on our commitments. And Hobbes says that in this law of nature consisteth the fountain and original of justice, where no covenant has proceeded, no right has been transferred, and everybody has right to everything. But once we actually have a covenant made, to break it is unjust. And so the definition of injustice is no other than the non-performance of covenant, and whatsoever is not unjust is just. And so there's a lot of discussion about why people do the wrong thing. Can you be wicked and be successful? What justice and injustice means when we use them to talk about human beings, actions, and all of those sorts of things. But we're going to skip over that and not worry too much about that. But what we have here is a rule, a law of nature that says once you've made an agreement, you have to follow through on it. That is what it means to be just. To break them is unjust. The fourth law of nature has to do with gratitude. The way that Hobbes frames it is a person who receiveth benefit from another of mere grace, endeavor that he which giveth it shall have no reasonable cause to repent him of his good will. Why? Because nobody gives but with intention of good to himself, because gift is voluntary and all that. So he's saying if people are good to you and they give you something without requiring something from you, don't make it bad for them. Don't complain about the gift that you got, for example. Don't do bad things to them so that they say, why did I help this person out, right? And he calls that gratitude. That's a virtue for Hobbes, as opposed to ingratitude, which is a vice. The fifth law of nature, which he calls complaisance, which is kind of an old-fashioned word for getting along, runs like this. Every person should strive to accommodate himself to the rest. He says, we can consider there is in human beings aptness to society, a diversity of nature rising from diversity of affections, not unlike to that which we see in stones brought together for building an edifice. The stone which by the asperity, the roughness, and irregularity of figure takes more room from others than itself fills, and for the hardness cannot be easily made plain, and thereby hindereth the building, is by the builders cast away as unprofitable and troublesome. So don't be that stone that doesn't fit in. Be willing to adapt yourself to the society of others. That is a law of nature. Once again, a general rule that we can follow. With number 6, we get to another important aspect of life. And he says, upon caution of a future time, a man ought to pardon the offenses past of them that repenting desire it. Pardon is nothing but the granting of peace. So if somebody does something wrong and they say they're sorry and they maybe make amends or something like that, you should pardon those offenses and not demand punishment or redress or retribution, or as he's going to talk about in the next one, revenge, right? That helps to preserve a viable relationship and society. Number 7, we could talk about is rational punishment. He actually frames it like this. In revenges, that is retribution of evil for evil, men look not at the greatness of the evil past, but the greatness of the good to follow. And what he's actually proposing here is that not that people don't get punished, but that they're punished in order to deter others from engaging in that action and to keep them from engaging in it as well. He says, we are forbidden to inflict punishment with any other design than for correction of the offender or direction of others. So he's saying, don't just try to, attain justice for the victims or something like that. The victims are gone or dead or something like that. Or perhaps if they're living, you could redress it in that way. But what we're really looking at is a much more utilitarian approach where we say, well, how are we going to keep this person from doing this in the future? How are we going to keep others from doing this sort of thing? Number 8 is another quite interesting one. He says that because all signs of hatred or contempt provoke to fight, we have this law of nature that no person by deed, word, countenance, or gesture declare hatred or contempt of another, the breach of which law is commonly called contumely. Now, we don't use that word contumely, right? Are you a contumelious person? No. We call somebody a jerk or an a-hole or something like that, right? And he's saying don't display hatred, which is a more active thing, and don't display contempt, where you don't care about the person at all. Don't display this in words. Don't display it in gestures. Don't display it in actions. Don't display it in countenance, which is your facial expression, right? So that's an important one. Closely related to this, number 9, he says, every person should acknowledge others for their equal by nature. And this is going against our natural tendency to think that we're better than everybody else. The breach of this precept, he says, is pride, thinking that we're better, acting as if we're better than others. So we're supposed to acknowledge others as being on the same level as us. Number 10 is closely related. He says, on this law dependeth another, that at the entrance into conditions of peace, no person required to reserve to themselves any right which they're not content should be reserved to every one of the rest. So if I want to say that it's okay for me to play my music loud, I've got to be cool with other people playing their music loud, and I'm being a jerk, I'm breaking the law of nature if I'm saying I'm the exception, I get to do that thing, I should occupy a position of privilege, or be, better than everybody else. So that's an important one. And then we get to things that have to do with conflicts themselves. So the next one, he says, if a person be trusted to judge between other people, it's a precept of the law of nature that they deal equally between them. Without that, the controversies of people cannot be determined other than war. So if you can't actually rely on a just arbitration, then it makes sense. It's rational just to go into conflict, right? And this leads to all sorts of problems. So he says that the person who's partial in judgment doth what in him lies to deter people from the use of judges, and is the cause of war. So the observance of this law is called equity, and the violation, exception of persons, or as we would call it, partiality, or corruption, we might even say. Number 12 also has to do with justice in some respect. He says, things that cannot be divided should be enjoyed in common if it can be. Think about like a park, right? You can have your little portion of a park or be at a campsite, but really we should allow everybody to be able to use the park, and you're not going to divide it up into permanent slots for everybody. So they should be enjoyed in common if it can be, and if the quantity of the thing permit without stint. Otherwise, proportionably to the number of them that have right. So you can't be in the park occupying a space the entire time. You've got to have some, you could leave it for other people too, right? Or if we're talking about common reserves of, say, fish or something like that, you can't fish out all the fish for just yourself, or, forests, things along those lines. The 13th one, he tells us that here again, we're dealing with conflict. All people that mediate peace should be allowed safe conduct. Isn't that an interesting idea? Anybody who is involved in the process of trying to resolve conflict, don't go after them. Why does Hobbes have to make this a rule? Presumably because it was something that was being violated quite frequently in his society. Remember that he lived through the English Civil War and had to flee it for France. Finally, number 14, and this kind of goes back to the beginning again, says it's the law of nature that those who are at controversy submit their right to the judgment of an arbitrator. Why? Instead of deciding things for ourselves or just trying to impose ourselves on the other person, we should go through some sort of formal process in which somebody else decides. Now, of course, that means that number 11 has to be in force, right? We have to have an arbitrator who's going to judge fairly, but this is something that allows us to not be in a state of war with other people. He tells us that there's other things that we could talk about. For example, drunkenness and other parts of intemperance. And he says these may be reckoned among those things that the law of nature has forbidden, but they're not necessary to be mentioned nor pertinent enough to this place. So this is not necessarily a totally exhaustive list. You have to apply some common sense to it as well. And these are, if you put them together with the first two laws of nature, we have a pretty, long and consistent set covering the way a person ought to reason and then the way a person ought to behave in a society where there's some reasonable expectation that other people will follow these as well, so that you can live a secure and more enjoyable life.